Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. So happy to see you all again. And thank you so much for choosing the Customer Success Network and our webcast once again in 2021. Um, it's not been an easy start for the world. It's been a bit of a rocky start to the year, but we do hope that your personal start to the year has been positive. Today, I have with me Amy Levine, Customer Health Program Manager at Slack. And when it comes to today's topic of building your first customer health score, there is no one better to take us through it than Amy. She has a very rich customer success operations and project management background and has rolled out customer success health scores in global customer success teams like WalkMe and Zero Cater. She's also a delight to collaborate with, and I can't tell you really how glad I am to welcome her here today. Today's topic is around health scoring, and in particular, how to start building your first health score. It can be such a daunting exercise, I think we all know that. And with the tons of information and advice online, it really can be hard to focus and manage this big project from start to finish. Thankfully, we have Amy to tell us how to find what matters to our company and make sure our team's attention is focused on it when it comes to customer health. As always, post your questions in the chat box and the Q&A. We're going to try to get them either in the middle or towards the end of the presentation. And we're streaming live in our workplace community. You'll be able to watch the recording there later, and we're also going to upload it onto our YouTube channel. I'm going to stop sharing. Amy, are you with us? Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen and we'll get into it. Okay. All right. So as Marika mentioned, my name is Amy Levine. I am based in Oakland, California, and I am a customer health program manager at Slack. I have a background in project management, marketing, and customer success operations. I've implemented a few health scores in various iterations. So I'm really excited to share some practical tips and lessons from my experience that hopefully you can take forward into your own customer health efforts. Okay, so we want to start with a poll just to get a sense of everyone's familiarity. So Marika, would you like to send it out?
Everyone should see the poll on their screens. Feel free to just select the answer that's most applicable. Amy, we're getting loads of answers, and I have to say that between the second and the third answer is a very, very close race.
It's a great start. If someone has a perfect health score, I'm very excited to hear more.
I think we're probably getting towards everyone that's joined us today. A good split between the second and the third option.
Great. Okay, should we move forward?
Absolutely.
All right, great. So it sounds like a lot of people have some experience or have heard about health scores. That's a really great place to start. If you want to learn more about how to do it, I'll definitely share some tips for, where do you start? How do you narrow down your list? And then if you already have a health score and you're looking into, what are some ways to better iterate upon it and make it a little bit stronger, we'll get into that as well. So I'm glad that you guys are all here today. Hopefully this will be helpful for you. We'll go over really quickly what is a health score, how to build it, aligning with your CS process, since that's pretty important, and then also talking about measuring success and iteration. So let's start with why. Why might a CS team start thinking about implementing a health score? And I think the big thing here is that as your team is growing and scaling, it can become really challenging to understand if your customers are seeing value, if they're likely to renew, and also identify where should your CSMs focus and prioritize. So the more customers you have, the harder it can be to get that level of granular detail into what your customers are doing and where to focus. So these are pretty common questions and challenges that most CS teams face. And then from a CS management perspective, if you're thinking about what a health score might solve, can really help drive consistency. So the goal is to really provide internal visibility into leading indicators of both risk and opportunity, adding that consistency around risk and health. So you're not just depending on a CSM individual saying, yeah, the customer's fine, or no, I don't know if they're doing well. You can really start to bring that standardization. And then also, it's really designed to help drive action. So it can help your team work on consistent methodology around how to address risk and how to address upsell opportunities. So as your team is scaling, bringing this consistency and this extra level of insight into your customer base, it's a really helpful tool for that. So let's talk basics. What is a health score? I'm sure you've heard a lot, and there are a lot of, sounds like, upcoming sessions to dive into it further. A health score is really an early warning signal. So it's typically a red, yellow, green score on a scale from 0 to 100. And it's designed to give you that earlier visibility at a glance into how your customers are doing and how they're trending over time. So in general, it can help quantify and track health in a simple framework. Usually it combines objective and subjective measures. This really depends on your business. And then it can help proactively identify which customers need additional attention, whether it's risk or upsell. In thinking about how companies typically use a health score, I like to think about it as you have your score, it drives action, and then you get insights and impact out of it. So it's designed to be an early warning signal, but it's really important that you build into your practice how to use it. So in that case, it would be processes for your CS team, whether it's looking at the health score and diagnosing if there's actually something going on, what the root cause is. Also building playbooks that they can use to address those risks or upsell opportunities. And then from there, the insights and impact, that has a greater impact on your organization, because from health scoring, from action, you can start to learn what those predictors are of churn and predictors of renewal. You can see health trends over time, and also areas of focus to better improve your customer results. So maybe you didn't know that you have a really large portion of your customers who are, they don't have executive engagement, or they're not logging into your product. A health score is a really nice way to start to see that on a larger trend. And so that's kind of the way that you can put those health scores into use in your business from an individual level all the way up to your leadership. So very quick introduction. I know there's a lot more we could get into, but I'd love to get into the practicals. So let's talk about where to start if you're thinking about a health score, and even if you want to see if it's right for you. With any good project, you want to start with why. So outlining your goals is really important here. So, thinking through, what are you trying to solve for? Is the main reason you're looking for a customer health score to predict renewals and also prevent churn? Are you looking to improve CS efficiency? Is global CS methodology alignment, is that important to you? And usually efficiency and methodology alignment tend to come together as you're working on your health score. But try to make sure you're clear with your business about why you want to build one. The second thing is really think through who should be a consumer of this. Is this only for your CSMs? Would it be helpful for sales? Typically it is. Thinking through how will your leadership team want to review your health score and learn from it? And then also, how do you plan to use those insights? So it's really important, it's typically you build a health score and not everybody uses it, or you're not clear on what to do. That is where a health score will fall. So it's really important to align in the beginning. What do we plan to do with these insights? How do we plan to use it in our leadership reviews, in our ongoing operations cadence? And coming out of those discussions, I like to have a set of design principles that I can come back to as I'm going throughout the project. So these are just some of the ones that I tend to fall through. Really making sure it's simple. I think that's really important, especially if you're first rolling out a health score. If it's too complicated and people can't understand what's driving it, it can make it really hard for your CS team to adopt it and also know what to do with it. Reliability, we'll get into this as we talk about how to select your measures. It's really important that if it's a manual indicator or it's an automatic indicator, that people will trust and know that they can rely upon the data of your health score. And also that it does do what it intends to do, right? So you want to be able to validate that it is driving renewal prediction. Also actionable, that's a pretty important design principle for any health score. You want to make sure people can do something with it. And then accessibility, this really comes down to the personas that you want to have visibility into it. So if you're building your health score in Gainsight or in an Excel spreadsheet, making sure that people can access it and you can tie it back to your data to prove if it's successful, that's all really important. So thinking through design principles with your stakeholders, it's a really, really great place to start. So making sure you get early alignment always is it's a great best practice. Okay, so let's get to planning. Again, you want to identify your project team. So decision makers, stakeholders, and subject matter experts. It's really great to bring your CSMs into this project. So maybe you have a few more senior CSMs or CSMs who've done this before. They're the ones who are working with customers day to day. They'll have a good sense of what those metrics might be, what would be really good indicators. And also they're going to help be your champions when you're ready to roll out that health score. Your technical team, this really depends on how you want to build out your score. So maybe I'll jump to this second piece here. If you intend to use a customer success platform, such as Gainsight, Tatango, Client Success, I know there are a lot of them. Usually those teams will help you kind of project management. So they provide a lot of great resources for how to build out your score, how to connect your data on the back end. That will really help you dictate what your project team is going to look like. But let's say you want to develop a house in score or a score in-house. You could build something with Excel. You could also use your CRM and a data visualization tool like Tableau. There are a lot of different ways you can build it, and that's going to really dictate who you want to work with internally. So these are just a few things to think about before you start to move forward. And maybe in a lot of cases, if you're at the very early stages and you don't have the buy-in to invest in a customer success tool, maybe you'll want to start by testing something in-house, just in an Excel spreadsheet, and then proving value before you go and ask for additional resources. Okay, so this is the fun part. Thinking through your customer health metrics. I'd say start simple. So I'll go through some best practice, but in the beginning, you really want to think about quantitative and qualitative measures that you are looking at today in your business. So what are those indicators of health, value, and success that you're looking at now? What else would you want to measure? And think about your customer journey. So maybe there are certain milestones that you know are important to a customer's potential success. Maybe there's product adoption data that you have access to. You want to list them out in a spreadsheet. And this is that beginning initial brainstorm phase. So there are a lot of different things that you can look at, right? And this is kind of where a lot of people get stuck. They want to look at a lot of different metrics. In general, you'll want to narrow it down to about 5 to 7 metrics in the end. But in the initial phase, this is a great time to get input from your CS team and even your data team about those metrics that could be applicable. So what I'm showing you here is, in general, best practice for health scores. There tend to be a few different categories that people look at. So product adoption tends to be a really strong one, first of all, because it indicates value. Second of all, because you can, if you have a good data connection, you can automate those inputs, so you're not relying as much on manual assessments. So a few common metrics from product adoption might be license utilization, depth of usage. So are they using sticky features? Last login date, go live date. There are a lot of different metrics, and it really depends on what your company has access to. Value and ROI. This is a kind of tricky one to measure, but I want to talk about it really quickly, just to say that if you have a place that you're tracking it today, maybe it's a drop-down field in Salesforce, or you're tracking use cases and customer outcomes. That would be a really great place to put it in the health score so that you can see how your customers are doing as far as their value realization. Engagement and relationship are also pretty common measures. So maybe you are measuring the frequency of emails with your customers or meetings, and maybe you're logging that in a consistent way. Maybe you can measure your stakeholder relationships. So if you know that your executive sponsorship is something that drives renewal, in most cases it is. So maybe that's something that you'd want to be heavily weighted in your score. Some companies use NPS and CSAT. That would also be a measure that you could include in your health score. Some companies also use CSM sentiment. So maybe for your first build, you want to add that indicator of how the CSM feels the customer is doing. That's totally fine. that's something that you can consider and either build out in Gainsight or, in-house. So this is just a starting point. I'd say in the brainstorm phase, list out all of the things that you think could be potential metrics for your health score, and then you'll start to narrow it down based on a set of principles. So I know that's a lot. Let me get into some tips on how to actually start narrowing down your list. So this can be one of the hardest parts. Again, it's where I like to refer back to my design principles. So for each measure that I've listed out, is it simple? Does it serve the purpose? What is the source? So is it reliable? And then how can we act upon it? If it doesn't meet those criteria, that's when I tend to say, I don't think this is right for a health score. Maybe it's something we want to pull in as additional reporting that can help round out our view of how our customer is doing. But in general, if you're only sticking to 5 to 7 metrics, it's pretty important that they are actually indicators of potential growth and potential churn. So some questions I like to ask myself as I'm going through this list is, why is this a health indicator? Does it correlate to renewal, growth, or value? And then do I know what positive or risky behavior looks like? Next, for the source, identifying where that data comes from. You might have some things that you want to track, but maybe you don't have a way to track it today. Maybe you put that on your backlog. That's for your future build. In general, it's better to, as I mentioned, err on the side of automated inputs versus manual inputs. But for your first round, maybe you don't have access to a lot of data, and that's fine. You can build out fields that your team is filling out, but you want to make sure that it's reliable. And then finally, what action should your CS team or your business take based on this indicator? So for example, let's say a last login date is a score that, or is a metric that you want to include in your score. This is just an example. So let's say the purpose in this case is you as a business have found that customers who don't log into your product within X number of days are less likely to achieve value and are less likely to renew. So in that case, it would be fitting that purpose that you're setting out to achieve, right? It's indicated, it's indicative of renewal. It's a health indicator. And also we know what risky versus positive behavior looks like, right? So maybe you want to build out the days of last login and associate those with red. So maybe it's risky if the customer isn't logged into your platform within 90 days. Maybe in 60 days, 60 to 90 days, maybe that's going to be your yellow. Maybe 0 to 30 is a good thing. So if you can start to think about your metrics in that way, you can use your data team, or you can even just come up with it as a business. It kind of depends on where you're at. That's a really great way to verify and test this is going to be a good metric. Source. So let's say you have the product analytics data, it's pulled into Salesforce, or you can connect to it directly. Great, then this would also be a good example of a metric. And then CS action. If you know what action you'd want your CS team to take, so let's say you build an email template that the CSM can send to your customer when their last login date is in the red. Great, that's something they can send out, and then you can start to test and measure your customer behavior based on that action. So this, I'd say, would be a good metric to include just because it hits those criteria. But I do want to say there's no perfect formula. So it really comes down to what matters to your business. And maybe you don't have a good source. Maybe you're not clear on CS action. This is a great time to work with your CSMs and also work with any data team or leadership that you have to start narrowing it down and refer back to your design principles. So I know that's a lot. I feel like this will be a really good place to stop because I know a lot of people tend to get hung up on this process. So I'd love to answer any questions that you have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Amy. It is loads of valuable information so far. People on Zoom attendees, please post your questions either on the chat or in the Q&A. We'll stop here for about 5-6 minutes to answer them. While people are typing, there's one thing that I was wondering about actually, particularly around the correlation with renewal growth or value. How do you find out whether a metric correlates with that? Like what steps would you take and what teams would you collaborate with?
That's a really great question. So I've been really fortunate to work with a BI team and our data analysis teams in the past. And what I've asked them to do is to look at those metrics as correlated to renewals and looking at the time frame. So the health score, when I think about when do I want in the customer journey for this health score to be used, I tend to ask our data team at 6 months prior to renewal and 3 months prior to renewal, what thresholds of data would indicate either renewal or churn. So for example, at WalkMe, we looked at the number of deployables that a customer had built. And so over time, the more that you've built, right, the more value you're going to see and the more likely you are to renew. We were able to come up with a number of deployables and a different mix of types of deployables that they'd built to confirm, okay, at the end of 6 months, if you've built this many, you are this much more likely to renew. And then we built our targets around that. So that, again, I was really fortunate to have a good data team there. I would say if you don't have a data team where you can start to think about those things, start to talk to your CS team and build out your customer journey. And then think about, okay, at this stage, 6 months, 3 months prior to renewal, what would I want to see? And then you can start to go back and even look at your customers who renewed and churned in the last 6 months, last year, see what they have in common and see if there's any data that you can find that you might be able to trace back. And maybe you start your first health score with a hypothesis and you say, we think that this is risky behavior and we think that this is going to correlate with renewal outcomes. Test it out, give it a few quarters, and then you can start to validate your hypothesis. And I'd say that's probably the best place to start.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a number of questions. Let's try and get through as many as possible in the next 5 minutes. It's possible that we're getting into this later, so do let us know if that's the case. A question from Darina: how much weight would you recommend giving to the CSM sentiment metric in comparison to the other data-driven metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to get into weighting in the next slide, but I will say, if you're just rolling this out and you want to build credibility, I would say CSM sentiment, maybe 20%. Over time, I would break it down to maybe 10% or 15%. I'd really weight heavily the more automated inputs and the more data-driven inputs. That being said, again, CSM sentiment will be important, especially over time. If you can see that all of your other metrics are red, but your CSM sentiment is green, that's going to be a really good opportunity to look into it and see, okay, what are we missing? Is our score wrong, or are we just being a little bit too conservative? So I'd say in the beginning, maybe around 15, 20%, but over time, you'll probably want to drop the percentage there.
Awesome. Maybe two more. How frequently do you present customer health scores to your senior stakeholders internally?
Yes, that's a great question. So we'll get into that later, but for my purposes, I think when I worked in operations, everything was pretty much on a quarterly cadence, and we would analyze churn rates, renewal rates, along with our health score. But in an ongoing cadence, I think it's really important to bring it into any meetings that you have related to risk, related to health. So we have every other week, we have risk meetings with each of the functional leaders. I would bring the health score to those meetings if I see anything that's changing over time, or if I notice anything there. So either, every other week, once a month, or once a quarter, depending on who your audience would be. If you want to drive more strategic real-time conversations, I think it's a really good thing to bring to your leadership team at least once a month.
Yep. Excellent. And finally, in smaller businesses, where do you see the ownership or creation of a health score sitting? Would that be product operations or CS?
Probably a partnership between the two. I would say that CS, because CS owns, customer renewals and the customer relationship, and CS will be the main ones acting upon it. I would say CS should kind of own where they'd like the score to go. But as far as actual design and the data inputs behind it, I would work with product operations to get as much data as possible. And then I, from my CS perspective, would narrow it down to what I know or what I assume customers care about the most. So I think it would be a really strong partnership in that case. Depends on your teams as well. Yeah.
We have so many more questions, but I'll let you continue and we'll tackle them at the end.
Great. Okay. Thank you guys for your excellent questions so far. Okay. So once you've narrowed down your metrics and you want to start building out the score, you'll want to assign red, yellow, and green thresholds, as well as weights based on how predictive those measures are. Sorry, 1 second. There's a lot of light coming into my face.
That's okay. In Amy's defense, it is very, very early where she is, so I'm sure that the sun changes position at this time of the day a lot.
Yeah, it's 8:30 here. Well, you're just gonna see a bunch of blinds and lights on my face. It's fine. I'll just pretend I'm partying. Okay. So when it comes to weights, well, let's start with red, yellow, green. So for each metric, you'll have your definitions. Make sure you're really clear on what those are. Your red, yellow, and green, if you have a data team that you can work with, that's really where they should start to say like, okay, for customers who've renewed, these are the thresholds we'd recommend for green. For red, these are customers who churned, or we know that over time they're likely to churn. And then yellow would be kind of that in-between phase. You can decide what you want that threshold to look like. And then as far as weighting goes, this is a really great opportunity again to bring in your CSMs and get their take on which signals they believe are stronger. Also, if you only have a few data points that you know correlate to renewals, I would weight those higher. So this is an example. Let's say I've done churn analysis and I know that customers without an executive sponsor are more likely to churn. Cool, I know that. I'm gonna go ahead and put the weight at 25% because that's a huge indicator. And then for license utilization, I know based on my historical data or based on customers who churned, that is a very strong indicator of whether they're going to downsell or whether they're going to leave us. Great, I'm going to put that weight higher. So this is just an example, again, not, it's not any company's specific example. But as you're thinking through the weights, that's pretty important to really make sure as you're starting, you want those automated or those stronger indicators to be more heavily weighted. To answer that earlier question, I put 15% for CSM sentiment here. It's all a guess. And I think the important part here is it's an art and a science. And then you can start to validate against your customers to really see, is this actually a strong indicator? So we'll get into that in a minute. Sorry, the light is still coming in. 1 second.
That's okay.
Oh, good fun. Is everyone having fun? Okay.
We can see you perfectly and you look great, so don't worry about that.
Oh, sweet. Okay. So all of your weights should add up to 100%, right? Then it's going to be important as you're thinking about your score. And I do want to say this, I'm just showing examples if you were to build it out in your own Excel spreadsheet. But if you're working with Gainsight or you're working with another company, you won't have to think too much about these formulas. So something to think about. So for your overall score, let's say for the sake of this exercise, I want 0 to 50% to be red, 50 to 75% to be yellow, and 75 to 100 to be green. In that case, let's test this against an example. So to see it in action, if I'm in a spreadsheet and I wanted to build this out, I've filled in some raw data for each of these metrics. So each metric is associated with the score from above. Let's say license utilization is 80%, feature adoption 30%, NPS is 7, executive sponsorship, let's say that's a drop down, and I selected it as strong, and CS sentiment is good. So each of those correlate with a score from above, green, red, or yellow. Now again, green, red, and yellow are just colors. They're not numeric values, so you can't multiply those against a weight. So I added a raw numeric score just for the sake of this exercise, and anything like Gainsight or another customer success tool, they'll have automatic weighting in the back end. But for this exercise, if you want to build it out in Excel, I assigned green 100, red 30, and yellow 60, just for the purposes of the exercise. Then I multiply the raw numeric score against the weight, and that's how I get the net score for each of these metrics, which brings me to an overall score of 80. So let's say, and I'll get into validating it in the next slide. This would be your score overall. Let's say I'm looking at a customer example and I'm like, they're actually not that. I don't think they're actually in the green. I can either adjust my score weights for your overall score, or you can start to think through like, what does the weight actually look like? And maybe that's an opportunity to tweak it. So I know this is a lot of data to look at. I hope it's not too confusing, but I'll talk a little bit next about how to start validating your score. Okay, So before you launch, and once you've outlined your desired thresholds and weights, it's really important to sanity check your scores. So I'd recommend testing against a representative sample of your current customers. And then also, if you're able to test against customers who renewed or had renewals in the last 6 months, you'll be able to see, okay, does this actually line up with what I'm trying to do? For those initial results, just consider adjusting weights and thresholds if they look off. Bring in your CSMs and ask, okay, for your current customer base, are the green customers actually healthy? Are red at risk? Is anything missing or off? And then also checking the distribution is really important before you go live. So in some cases, we've built out health scores and then you see everybody's green or everybody's red. You really want to make sure there's some distribution across each of those scores to make sure that it does in fact kind of cover the range of your customers. If the representative sample looks good enough, great, you can start to move forward with your build. If you think there's things you can tweak, again, those are your resources. So you can start to adjust. If we go back, you can adjust these thresholds for red, yellow, and green overall, or maybe you decide that you want to tweak what these percentages are or what those weights are. So there's a lot that you can do there. I'd say keep it simple. If it looks directionally accurate, then that's a really good place to start because no health score is going to be 100% indicative of renewal. It's not going to be a perfect forecasting tool. So it won't be perfect, but if you feel good enough about where it is and your CSMs are able to provide that input, that's going to really help with your future adoption. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Let's assume you've sent it off, you're building it. The next step is really to build out your internal calls to action. So it's important that your team knows what they can do when they see the customer health score, and then also for you and your leadership team to really align on what red, yellow, and green mean. So for example here, if you are saying red is unhealthy, you are telling your org, that means we need to diagnose risk, work with the account team on risk mitigation. Yellow, maybe that just means you want to set up a more regular cadence with the customer, keep an eye out in case there's any kind of indication of future risk. And then green, thinking about green as a healthy customer, there are a few different options there as a business. So you want to partner on expansion opportunities, and then also thinking about champions. So surfacing to marketing or working on your champion and advocacy efforts, that's a really great way to utilize green. So as an org, this is a good way to start thinking about how you're going to use those overall scores. And then for your CSMs, you should really think about what do you want them to do for each measure, because it's not just your overall score, but each measure has its own red, yellow, and green. And maybe you decide that, hey, we want to focus on executive sponsorship in the next 2 quarters. So you could look at all the customers who have red executive sponsorship, and you could build out a playbook for that. Or for example, low product adoption. Having these playbooks in the ready when you're ready to release the health score, it's really going to help your team know what to do and how to actually use the score to drive their account plans. And also you can build out template emails, you can build out template decks. So really thinking about how you can templatize what the CSM should be doing and share that knowledge based on your health score. That's going to really help them put it into practice and not just make it a vanity metric. Okay, another thing to do in pre-launch is thinking about that process, right? So my big thing here is that change management is always going to be a challenge. Everybody knows that, especially something like a health score. If it's a new metric that you're pulling in and expecting people to act upon, it's really important that you're building that health score into their existing process. So if you build it into the meetings and the internal account planning that they're already doing, it's so much more likely to be adopted and to drive value. A few options here in thinking about, when we just rolled out our health score at Slack, we really tried to focus on how we're going to bring it into internal meetings and also customer journey milestones. So for example, if you're a manager and you're first rolling this out, pull it up first thing in your one-on-ones. Bring it up in your team meetings, look at your customer distribution and start a conversation about, hey, it looks like these are certain trends that we're seeing across the team. What do you guys think is contributing to this? Make it a conversation because you don't want it to be something where you're saying, hey, all this data is red, all your customers are unhealthy, go fix it. That's not the point of it. It's to start that conversation so your team can take ownership of diagnosing and really driving action. So another way to build this into your process is if a customer is assigned to a CSM, great, look at the health score, get a sense of where they've come, how they're doing, and then also in your account planning with your sales team. For customer journey milestones, I'd mentioned that 6 months prior to renewal mark. The reason I think that that's a smart time to look at your health score is because usually if you're in a SaaS business and you're in the quarter of renewal, there's only so much you can do to really influence the outcome of that renewal. But 6 months prior to renewal, that's when you can start to say, hey, these are the things we're going to focus on in the next quarter to get you to a place where when renewal time comes, this isn't going to be a risk anymore. So those are really good milestones to start having your CSMs use this as they're putting together the renewal preps or working with the renewal team. And then also as they're going into a QBR, this is a great tool to help surface some potential things that they could talk about. Another thing you'll want to build out for process is making sure you have good reports, dashboards, and even alerts. I'd say when you're first starting with a health score, you don't want to over alert. There can be a lot of alert fatigue and it can create a lot of frustration, but definitely thinking through like, how am I going to put this in front of a CSM that doesn't require them to go into something outside of their current day-to-day work. So just making it as clear and easy for them as possible. Okay, so once you have your reports, your process, and your playbooks, you are ready to roll out. So congratulations, you rolled out your first health score. My big disclaimer is that it's not going to be perfect for all customers. Scores should evolve over time. So it can take about 1 to 2 quarters to really understand how effective your score is. But I want to go over some basic success metrics you can use to measure how effective your score is when you first launch it. Really driving back to that goal that you set out when you were first creating a score, are we able to identify churn proactively? How far in advance did we notice it? Did it become red? You want to look at the churn rate for customers who are green, yellow, and red. So by the time I left at WalkMe, we had directionally accurate scores, which was really great. So our red accounts had a higher percentage of churn than yellow, which had a higher percentage of churn than green. That's really where you want to be. Doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be like 150, 0, but if you're starting to see that those percentages are improving in the right direction, that's how you can start to tell that your score is doing pretty well. You also want to start looking at percentage of churn missed. So greens that you ended up churning, that's a really great learning opportunity for you as a business. So you can see, okay, what are we really missing? And then, and to build your strategy and maybe tweak your score around it. Also, a really great metric to prove the effectiveness of your CS team is what percentage of reds were we able to improve? And can we even tie that back to our playbooks, right? So if we saw that a customer's red 6 months prior to renewal, we implemented this playbook, we got them to yellow, which then we got them to renewal. That's a really great validation of your score and also of your CS team. And then which playbooks are effective as well. So from there, we're almost at the end here, and thank you for listening to me ramble a bunch. Future phase and iteration, this is really important, and based on what I've learned and what I've seen from a lot of colleagues, reevaluating every 6 or so months is probably the right cadence for iteration. So you want to look and see every quarter, monthly in the very beginning, how are you performing against success metrics? But then every 6 months, I'd say is probably the right amount of time to actually make improvements and adjustments, just because if you adjust it too frequently, you're not going to be able to have reliable data and you won't be able to see trends over time. So a few other things to look at as you're evaluating the success of it. Are certain measures more effective at preventing or predicting churn? So you can see reds for each metric that are correlated with churn. Increase their weights maybe. Are there opportunities to automate these measures? That's always going to be something to consider as your business is evolving and as you're implementing new tools. Should we break the score into segmentation? This is a very common question. So maybe when you roll out your first score, it's going to be global, but then over time, as you're evaluating the score's effectiveness, maybe you break it into your customer segments and you notice that, hey, this is working for our really large customers, but for our smaller customers, maybe there's a different strategy we're taking and maybe we should change the weights or even change the metrics. Maybe there are new company objectives you can bring into the score, looking at playbooks again, getting feedback from your CSMs to see, hey, was this actually helpful? And then feedback. Get tons of feedback from people who are using it every single day and also from your leadership team to see how can you make it more effective? How can you drive more strategic conversations? And then how can CSMs better leverage it? So that's a lot. I want to give you a quick summary of top 5 things to remember. In general, you want to keep it simple, as I mentioned. There's a lot that you can look at, but really thinking through how can we as a business use this score to drive action. You want it to be actionable. You want people to understand it. And then aiming for automation over manual inputs, as I mentioned, that's just going to make it so much easier for you to manage, and also helps improve reliability. The next thing is building your score into your team's existing process. Make sure that it's not just a metric that lives somewhere that nobody's accessing. You really want it to become part of that conversation in order for it to be effective. And then finally, evaluation and iteration are so important to this process because it's not going to be perfect. Businesses change, your customers change. So reevaluating and measuring over time it's just going to make your score that much better. So get ready for that journey. Once you roll it out, the work's not done. There's a lot you can learn from it and start to use. But don't take my word for it. There are a lot of additional resources. So in the Customer Success Network, there are several more health score webinars coming out. There are tons of customer success blogs. I know Gainsight has a really good one. And then LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, reach out to your colleagues. There are lots of people who've done this before. This is my experience, but there are a lot of really important and helpful tips and tricks that multiple people have tried in different sizes of organizations and with different internal resources. So don't be scared. Take it slow and approach it with a simple lens when you're first starting, and just know that it's a journey. So with that, thank you guys so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Amy. That was amazing. Lots and lots of questions, so we're going to dive straight into them. Right. Thankfully, we have time. One which I found very interesting from Catherine: would you recommend a separate health score for each product a customer uses, or would you combine the health scores to give an overall score of a customer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In a few different cases, I would say if a customer is using different products, you can combine them, or you could take the ones that have the highest ARR or highest spend associated. So it kind of depends on how those products are distributed against the customer. In some cases, it's like way more complicated to build that out. So I would either take whatever they're spending the most on, or I would try to build some combined health score if it applies to the rest of your customers.
Awesome, thank you. We've had a rather bad experience with pushing CTA based upon health scores because CSMs feel a little spammed. What's your experience?
Yeah, I have a very similar experience. The change management, it's not necessarily about the health score, but it's about CTAs. It's about getting tons of alerts and getting spammed. I would say that's a very common challenge. At Slack, because I'm just building out their health score, we're going very light on CTAs and mostly focusing on playbooks and things people are already doing. So I would say have your CSMs, if you're really trying to change the mindset around it, remove your CTAs. Maybe you can have your CSMs be part of the solution, and really try to limit the number of CTAs and alerts. So if you're already there, work with your CSMs on what's the best way for them to do it. Maybe you guys just have a Google Drive with the playbooks that they can use, and you only use CTAs for things that you can automate, such as an email that they can quickly click and send out. So as long as it's providing more value than noise, then I'd say that's the way to approach it. But that's a really common challenge, and I've heard that from pretty much everybody who has implemented a lot of process and tooling around health scores.
Awesome. From CSMs moving to another internal stakeholder, customer success leaders, have you ever had a situation where a CS leader would like to set up a very complex score right from the get-go? What would you recommend to convince them that it's better to start simple?
Yeah, I've definitely had those meetings where the CEO is asking for all of these things because it's important to them, and the other stakeholders are asking for all these things. What I like to do is I take everybody's input, put it in a spreadsheet, and then I just use the data and bring it back to them. And I say, listen, if we have this many scores, and like the more you have in your health score, the more diluted each of them become. So if you have 20 different things you want to put in a health score, your team can't really act upon them, right? So if you are a business and you have 20 different priorities for your CS team, I don't think they're going to be as successful. So maybe, reframing it in terms of what are our top 3 to 5 priorities as a business, and then what are the data metrics that we can drive value and action that will actually, improve our results. So I would just say it gets diluted and then fall back on the data and your customer success priorities. The other thing I'd add too is I've kind of tempered some of that by adding an additional reporting. So for the reports of health scores, I'll say, listen, we're going to have a very simple health score, but then in those reports, I'm going to add a column for those 5 things that you also want people to look at. So they're taking it into consideration in addition to that health score.
Awesome. No, that's really good tip. Let's move to talking a little bit about the metrics and the criteria. In cases where you're not able to automate all of the measures at first, how regularly would you suggest updating the score manually?
Yes, great question. I'd say once a quarter is probably the best. So at Slack, we have a few things that we're unable to measure automatically. And so we've built fields for those. And then our guidance is once a quarter, or anytime you learn something new that would affect the health score coming out of an EBR, or you notice something that's happening on the customer side. So you can build that in as part of your team if you have internal QBRs where you're doing account prioritization, or you can just set that as your own internal directive for your team at the beginning of each quarter, update those fields. I think that's probably the most realistic way to keep your team moving forward, but also just making sure that you as a manager, if your team brings new risks to you, or there's something that they mention, that you are helping to reinforce that should go into the health score and that they should change it.
Great. And on a similar topic around weighting, can you expand on how you decide on weighting? Is it simply asking the CS team for a hunch and then trial and error from there? Or is there something more to it?
So what I've done with weighting is I work with CS leadership, and then I also look at what I know based on the data is more likely to correlate to churn. So yeah, I tend to weight more heavily anything that I have the data on. And then if the CS leaders say these are the top 3 things, I really make people kind of focus and prioritize. And then from there, come back with my weighting. Weighting can be really challenging and hard. Maybe when you start, you just want to have them all. I usually will start by putting them all at the same weight and then talking through, okay, which one is actually either it's a stronger data point, or we know that it's like actually truly a priority. Try to fall back on the data as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
It's challenging though. That's the hard part is iterating on that and tweaking it.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that came shown through from your presentation a lot is that you need to be there to look at the data and tweak. So I'm sure that it's not a one-off process.
Yeah.
More on metrics. Is there a rough rule of thumb about proportion between the different types of metrics, product adoption, value ROI, engagement?
Yeah, I'm not sure necessarily. I would say best practice that I've seen is like 2 metrics per category. But sometimes, if you're looking at value, usually there's only like 1 field for value or ROI. And a lot of people tend to be a little bit more heavy on customer relationship and product usage. So that's usually what I tend to see is a lot on relationship, maybe like even narrowing it down by customer stakeholders, and then a lot on product adoption, just because that tends to be the data that can drive the most quantifiable insights.
Great. Do you consider outstanding invoices as a good or bad health score?
I think it depends on your business. I have heard of that. If there's like actually like billing issues, I'd say if you have a high percentage of customers who are not paying you and you have a lot of outstanding invoices, and that tends to lead to, customer drop off, maybe that's something you want to consider as part of your health score. But in general, I would say that's more of like an ongoing administrative kind of customer management metric that, maybe you have a health score that's a little bit more strategic and can drive more strategic like value towards your customer, I'd say focus on those. But maybe you build that the outstanding invoices into your process so that you're reviewing any customers who are red, who are not paying their bills. Yep. Great. That's really where you should be focusing.
Yep, definitely. Another interesting one. In your experience, how have you handled the customer health score override? For example, those situations when something not being considered in the health score has caused huge risk, M&A, financial viability, loss of sponsor, so on.
Yeah, I wouldn't be too heavy-handed with overrides, but I do have, plenty of familiarity with them. In the past, we've used overrides for loss of sponsor because that has been pretty much a one-to-one relationship with potential churn. So I'd say it's really important if that's your like biggest risk and you know that it's going to be a challenge and you know that it's going to be like actually something you need to escalate to the highest level, you can build in an override. Just be really careful about that because if you build in an override, you might miss other signals underneath. So just make sure that you have really strong reporting so you can see each of those metrics individually and not just the overall score. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think there are different schools of thought on it, but you don't want to dilute the information that you're getting from the score. And maybe you have a separate escalation path for something like, that's kind of life-changing from your customer. So either use that red override or you have a separate escalation path where, you're just focusing on that as a red account.
Amazing. We'll keep you on for 2 more questions as we have the time. What if narrowing down the metrics becomes difficult without customer segmentation? Would you recommend creating different health scores?
If you are using segmentation,
what if narrowing the metrics becomes difficult without customer segmentation? So would you imagine, what if you're able to identify metrics, but they're so different between your customers?
Yeah, so if they're very different between your customers, so I would say if you have a ton of different metrics that might work for different types of customers, try to stick to like 2 separate segments. I wouldn't over segment and over engineer it. But if you have a lot of different metrics, like at Slack, we have a maturity score, which we took a whole bunch, like the team built before me. They have a whole bunch of different pillars of product usage that indicate maturity. And so those are built into one larger maturity score. And that is the score that we put into a health score. So there might be a few different things that will lead to customer usage and value. You could maybe bucket those together. And maybe you do decide like, okay, I want to have like 4 of these product usage metrics at like 10% or 5% each. I'd say that's really where you need to test it out. But I don't think having too many is really going to drive too much value for you. So I would try a few different things. Without specific examples, it's kind of hard to give really good insights, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thank you. One last question. In your opinion, are the health score capabilities of a customer success platform a good enough reason to invest in such a tool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know plus and minuses. There's lots of pros and cons of specific tools. It depends on what your budget is. I would say the customer success platforms have a lot of guidance, and that's where I think it's really great to start there. But it can be a little bit heavier, like a little bit harder to use all of the things that they're trying to push on you. So you can get a lot of CSMs with CTA fatigue, or it can be a huge change management issue to move your customer success all the way to a whole new platform. So health scores, I'd say if you're really small or you're like a medium size and you're just not sure what you want to do, maybe start by just building something in an Excel sheet to see if it's helpful. But I'd also say talk with other people who've used those platforms before to see what value they're getting out of it, because I do think that health scoring is a really strong feature in Gainsight and Tatango and other platforms. But you just want to be really clear about how does that fit into your CS process, and like what are the tools that they're using today, and will it add more value?
Makes
Did I
total
answer the
sense.
question?
I think you did. That was a really well weighted answer in the topic of today's conversation. I think we've gone through all the questions people have asked. If they can find you on LinkedIn, I think you
Yes.
mentioned.
Yes, please.
You can find Amy Levine on LinkedIn, and I'm sure that looking at how many questions people asked, we might ask you to come back and give us another webcast in the future.
Well, yeah. And thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out if you're working on a health score and you've learned other things. And I'm always curious to learn from others. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Amy. And a big thank you for everyone who joined today. Do join us in a couple of months' time. The next topic that we're going to talk about in February and March is going to be stakeholder management and organization mapping. So all of our events are going to be under that umbrella. Let us know what you thought of today. We can't wait to welcome you back. Have a fantastic rest of your day, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.